The town rose where the hills split to show a dark seam, and people said the earth there had a mouth that needed feeding. Men fed it and came back with coal on their skin, and the town turned that coal into bread and roofs. Sundays were for church, but weekdays were for the cave, and even the preacher touched the hoist with wet fingers like a blessing. Old folks said the cave was older than any house and warned that anything with a mouth can bite. In this place the foreman was king, and the king was Elias Grigg, a neat man with steady hands and a voice that never rose. He wrote safety on the chalkboard each dawn and made the men repeat it, and when he smiled it looked like a seal on a letter. A ledger sat open with lines like fences and tiny marks for each miner. People called those marks care, but Elias's care had weight. His gaze collected and sorted. He paused behind a man as if to measure breath, then set a finger to the ledger and moved on. The cave waited while he worked, dark and still except for a slow drip that kept time. He led safety prayers that were not prayers, just rules read in a calm tone while hands rested on stone. He told each man to touch the wall and feel its pulse, then studied the gray print the touch left on his palm. He called it a dust check. He drew a chalk line at shoulder height and watched who stooped. He timed how long a man could hold a breath by testing lamps in a closed tin. He said it was for safety, for knowing who could stand smoke, but his face softened only when a man trembled or blinked too soon. In the yard he made them march with lunch pails in rhythm and marked a cross when a pail clanged off time. He weighed boots and sent the light-footed to the deepest cut. He chose buddies by breath and cough, not friendship. He said the mine was a system and every system must be tuned, and the men obeyed because wages tuned their homes. He wound his cracked watch at the same hour, 3 turns, no more. Order was mercy, he said. In the morning the story truly begins. Fog lay in the hollows and the bell fell flat in the gray air. Elias reached the yard before light, walked the catwalk with a lamp and stopped at 3 points to make 3 small cuts in the rail with his knife. He shook fine salt into a tin cup and set it at the tunnel mouth the way a doctor sets gauze. He pressed his palm to the wall until the skin blanched, then held it to the lamp and studied the grit that glowed. He opened the ledger and marked 5 names with a dot, 5 with a dash, 5 with a circle, and left the rest plain. He did not speak about the reason, he called it safety. When the men gathered, the fog lifted and the mouth of the cave looked almost kind. They joked about the cold, then stood straight when Elias called the roll. He made each name sound like a vow. He checked the belt, lamp, boots, cough, eyes, and let his fingers linger on some shoulders and barely touch others. He sent 5 to clear the far chute, 5 to lay track by the wet seam, 5 to haul timbers, and the rest to the central face. He placed Jonas Hale, steady and patient, on coil duty by the air pump, calling it a lesson for younger hands. He told the hoist boy to grease the drum twice, then tap the wrench 12 times against the wheel. 12 kept the day from breaking, he said. When the cage dropped, Elias did not ride the roof as he sometimes did. He stood inside with the men so close he could hear breath and count it. The earth swallowed them the way it always did, yet the swallowing felt chosen. Above ground the town moved on with bread and the ring of the hammer. Below where the drip kept time, Elias touched his chalk line and watched which head brushed it. He listened for a cough that broke rhythm, a footfall that shook dust, a sigh that begged to be spared. History would later call what came next an accident. Elias called it a correction. As he raised his hand to signal the first move, the cave seemed to hold its breath and wait for the shape of his plan to lock into place, quiet as a key sliding home. The dawn came pale and weak, dragging a cold mist through the valley as if the earth itself wanted to hide what was about to unfold. The town stirred with its usual rhythm. Women at wells, children sweeping steps, church bells ringing in the distance. But down by the shaft, 45 men gathered around Elias Grigg like moths circling a quiet flame. Their faces were smudged with yesterday's coal and lined with years of labor, but their eyes carried a dull trust, the trust of men who believed that another day beneath the ground would end as it always had. With aching muscles, darkened lungs, and a loaf of bread earned, Elias watched them assemble with a calm that was almost tender, his hand resting on the leather-bound ledger tucked beneath his arm. To the men, that book was a record of safety drills and supplies, but to Elias it was scripture. Each page was filled with his private notes, marks beside names, coded symbols that only he understood. Some men were reduced to a single stroke, others layered with circles and lines that spoke of patterns only he could read. He had studied them for years, not as workers, not as friends, but as subjects in a vast experiment of endurance and submission. Their fears were written down like measurements. Jonas Hale, steady but prideful, dot beside his name. Samuel Derry, too quick to pray when the shaft groaned, circle drawn twice. Young Matthew Crow, mother dead of fever, weak lungs noted in fine script. These were not observations of care, but preparations for judgment. Elias believed each flaw was a fracture in the human design, and he had decided that today the cave would be the crucible that revealed who deserved to remain whole. When he raised his hand to call the roll, silence spread through the yard. He spoke each name as if it were part of a ritual chant, his voice even and stripped of warmth. To the men, it was routine, yet something hung in the cadence that made even the strongest shiver. They lined up and checked lamps, tied boots, adjusted belts, and swallowed the thick morning air as if it might be their last taste of freedom. Elias's gaze moved over them like a blade, lingering on the small tremors of hands, the dart of nervous eyes, the cough buried in a sleeve. To him, these were not flaws to forgive. They were signals, proof of weakness that demanded exposure. The mine in his mind was not a workplace, but a chamber of purification. And the men were not workers, but offerings. As they stepped toward the cage, Elias led them with deliberate slowness, his boots striking against the boards in perfect rhythm. The hoist boy waited with a hand on the wheel, but Elias stopped before entering, forcing the men to stand in the damp mist a moment longer. He tilted his head as though listening to something beneath the earth. The pause stretched thin until hearts began to beat faster. Then, with a faint nod, he stepped into the cage and motioned for the men to follow. The descent began, the metal screeching against rails, the lanterns swaying, the daylight shrinking above like a closing eye. The sound of the town faded, replaced by the heavy pulse of the earth pressing in on all sides. In the dark belly of the mine, the air grew thicker, dust clinging to tongues and throats, making breath heavy and uneven. For most, this was familiar discomfort, but Elias studied every reaction as though cataloging them anew. He saw how one man pressed fingers against his chest, how another shifted weight from one foot to the other to mask trembling. The cave magnified these small betrayals, turning them into confessions. To Elias, every cough was weakness made flesh, every stumble a truth revealed. He believed men showed their true selves only when stripped of air, light, and mercy. And he intended to strip them all. The deeper they walked, the more the atmosphere thickened until it felt less like dust and more like intent, as if the mine itself had been waiting for this moment. Elias raised his lamp and led them down a narrow cut, his face calm, his eyes calculating. To the men this was just another day, but to Elias it was a ceremony of choice. He moved them into groups without explanation. 5 sent to the wet seam, 5 to the far chute, 10 to haul timbers where the roof sagged, the rest divided among tunnels that swallowed them whole. Each placement was not about work, but about pattern, pressure, and test. Elias had arranged it like a conductor guiding an orchestra, every position chosen for what it would reveal about fear and obedience. The men did not know they were being sorted for sacrifice. They joked in low voices, muttered prayers, and lit lamps against the dark. But Elias knew. He knew who would break first, who would cling to hope until hope itself was poisoned, who would fight back until the fight was turned against them. His mind carried not pity but a cold hunger, a desire to prove that men were nothing more than fragile structures waiting to be collapsed. The mine was not their enemy. It was his instrument, his altar, his mouth to swallow 45 souls and leave behind nothing but silence. Above ground the sun climbed and the town carried on, unaware that the day already belonged to death. Below, Elias moved through the shafts like a priest among pews, his calm voice echoing off stone, guiding the chosen deeper into the dark where their fate was already sealed. History would call it a disaster, a collapse, an accident no one could have foreseen. But Elias knew better. This was no accident. This was the design. This was the order. This was the beginning of the great correction. The alarm spread through the town like fire leaping roof to roof. Women dropped buckets at the well. Children ran screaming through the streets, and men who were too old for labor hurried toward the shaft with tools in hand. They said the mine had collapsed, that the earth had closed its jaws on 45 husbands, fathers, and sons. Dust rose from the entrance in a heavy cloud, convincing even the doubtful that the mountain itself had swallowed the men whole. At the barricade, Elias Grigg stood with his ledger clutched against his chest, his face calm, his voice steady. He told the gathered crowd that the cave-in was total, that the rockfall had buried the workers beyond hope of rescue, that no one inside could have survived even a single breath. The people believed him because his eyes did not waver, and in his stillness they mistook authority for truth. Mothers screamed and fell to the dirt. Wives tore shawls from their shoulders, and children clung to one another, staring at the black mouth that had stolen their world. The air filled with prayer and wailing, yet Elias stood like a carved figure, silent, unblinking, as if he had already sealed the chapter in his mind. But beneath the earth, there had been no collapse. The walls had not buckled, the roof had not caved. Instead, Elias had led the men into a chamber he had spent years shaping in secret, a hollow carved not for coal but for control. Heavy beams held the roof steady, false rock piles blocked escape routes, and vents hidden in the ceiling controlled the flow of air. It was a prison disguised as disaster, a tomb that could be explained without a body being lifted. When the dust settled and the men opened their eyes, they saw not rubble but barriers that could not be moved. They realized, with growing dread, that the mine had not betrayed them. It was Elias who had. Panic came first in shouts and pounding fists, men demanding to break through, to claw back to light. Elias silenced them with a lamp raised high, his calm voice echoing off the stone. He said they must accept order, that he would keep them alive if they followed his rules, that chaos would only kill them faster. His words cut through their fear, and though doubt lingered in their eyes, they obeyed, because they could not yet believe that the man they trusted had become their captor. He moved through the chamber, dividing them into groups with the same precision he used in the yard. 5 were placed near the vents, 5 ordered to stack timbers, 10 sent to the far end where no air stirred. He rationed food and water with deliberate cruelty. One group given bread that crumbled into nothing, another left to drink from a barrel he knew would run dry within hours. He told them it was fairness, that he was keeping balance, but each distribution was a test. He was watching not their hunger, but their submission. When the lamps dimmed, Elias controlled the flame. He let light burn strong in one corner while extinguishing it in another, forcing some men to live in shadow while others basked under the glow. He studied how their eyes strained, how their tempers shifted in the dark, how quickly men fought when light was denied. He kept notes in his ledger, marking reactions with the same cold clarity he once used for tallying coal. To him, this was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a method, a trial by deprivation, proof that he could bend will without lifting a hand. He believed suffering was the purest instrument of order, and he played it with precision. The first night in that chamber was not marked by death, but by silence broken into fragments. Men whispered prayers that went unanswered. Some pressed their foreheads to the stone and begged for air. Others stared at Elias, their fear turning slowly into suspicion, yet none dared speak against him. He moved among them like a priest tending his flock, offering words of safety while stripping them of dignity piece by piece. He told them that to survive they must forget their old lives, that the cave was their world now, and that he alone held the key to balance. He closed his eyes as he spoke, as if reciting a sermon only he understood. Above ground, the town kept vigil, holding lamps at the barricade, waiting for the impossible sound of digging from below. Mothers clutched children and cursed the silence, but no sound rose to meet them. Days later, officials would declare all 45 dead, buried beneath tons of stone. Yet the truth was that they were alive, breathing the stale air of a chamber built by the man they had trusted most. They were not victims of falling rock, but prisoners of one man's obsession with order. And as the first night ended and Elias recorded their trembling in his book, the true collapse began. Not of stone, but of spirit, crushed by the slow hand of design. In the days that followed, the chamber beneath the earth became less a prison and more a theater where Elias rehearsed his dark philosophy. He moved with a calm certainty, as if each step followed a script he had memorized long before. The men whispered among themselves when he vanished into the side tunnel, dragging behind him crates that no one had ever seen used for mining. They heard the scrape of metal, the steady tap of hammer on steel and the low hum of a man working with devotion rather than haste. When he returned, he did not carry tools of labor but instruments of silence, objects crafted not for stone but for flesh. The first he revealed was what he called the breath cage. At a glance, it was a narrow iron frame with a mesh funnel fixed at the front, but its design was calculated with cruel intent. A man placed inside it could not lift his head nor turn his face. The funnel drew in the dust-heavy air of the mine, trapping the lungs in a cycle of inhalation that grew harsher with every breath. Elias forced a miner named Samuel Derry into it, strapping his wrists to the sides so he could not claw it away. He ordered the others to watch. Samuel's chest rose and fell in a frantic rhythm, each gasp dragging more grit into his throat until his coughs turned wet. His eyes bulged, veins swelling along his temples, but Elias merely noted the intervals in his ledger. 37 breaths before blood appeared at the lips, 50 before collapse. He released Samuel only when unconsciousness had reduced him to a husk on the ground. And with chilling serenity, Elias told the others that this was proof of why order must govern the body, for the body alone is weak. His second invention was the stillness rack. To the eye it resembled a crude frame of timber lined with nails angled inward, but the design carried a monstrous genius. The nails pressed lightly against the skin, shallow enough not to pierce if the body remained perfectly still. Yet each inhale and exhale shifted the chest against their points. Each twitch or flinch drove them deeper. He strapped Jonas Hale, the man who had once been proud enough to question him, onto its frame. The miners stood frozen as Jonas tried to control his breathing, trembling with effort as sweat poured down his face. Every movement betrayed him, nails sliding beneath the skin until beads of blood ran in lines across his ribs. The others begged Elias to stop, but he only tilted his head and wrote in his ledger. To him this was not cruelty but experiment. He said aloud that work itself was a rack, that labor punished every breath of the undisciplined, and only by surrender could pain become bearable. Jonas remained on the rack until his strength gave way, his body convulsing in sharp jolts that drove the nails deeper. When Elias finally released him, he lay broken, gasping like a fish hauled from water, and the silence in the chamber thickened until no man dared even whisper. What horrified them most was not the blood, but Elias's composure. He did not rage or shout. He spoke in the same calm tone he had always used to list safety drills, and his face carried the stillness of a man who believed he was saving souls, not destroying them. He explained each device as if it were a teaching aid, pointing out weaknesses revealed, endurance measured, obedience tested. He insisted that every man must one day face his own failing and that the mine was the only place fit to draw it out. His obsession was not with death, but with the slow peeling away of resistance, reducing men to raw silence where even their cries no longer mattered. Night after night he refined his methods. The breath cage grew narrower, the mesh denser. The stillness rack received adjustments that made the nails shift with weight, punishing not only motion but the very act of bearing one's own body. He spoke of progress the way a craftsman praises his work, and his victims were his evidence. Men stopped sleeping, fearful that they would wake strapped into a device meant to unmake them. Their hope drained as they realized this was not madness born of impulse, but the patient cruelty of design. Elias was not unraveling, he was fulfilling himself. The chamber became a place where sound itself died. The coughs, the groans, the prayers all weakened beneath the steady rhythm of Elias's control. He called his devices instruments of silence because they did more than hurt the flesh. They erased voice, will, and identity. By the fourth day, the miners no longer shouted for rescue or cursed his name. They lowered their eyes, tightened their lips, and let their terror rot inside their chests. Elias looked upon this quiet with something close to joy. In his mind, silence was proof of obedience, obedience proof of order, and order proof that the world was finally as it should be. Above the earth, families still gathered at the barricade, lighting candles and leaving food no one would eat. They imagined their loved ones buried beneath stone, unaware that they still lived, trapped in a chamber where every breath, every movement, and every word had become a weapon turned against them. For Elias, this was not a tragedy. It was perfection. A demonstration that men could be remade when stripped of everything except the choice to obey. The earth held its breath, and the instruments of silence waited for their next victim, while Elias marked another page in his ledger and prepared to test the limits of the human soul. The days bled into one another in the chamber, the air thick with damp stone and the metallic stench of blood. By then the men had learned that Elias's cruelty was never sudden but measured, paced like the tick of his pocket watch. When he turned his attention to food, they understood with sick dread that he would not allow hunger to come as it normally does, slow and gnawing. He would shape it into scripture. At first he rationed bread and dried meat in small cuts, offering a crust to one man and a handful of beans to another. The choices were not random. He gave a portion to one group while leaving another to starve, then switched without reason the following day. He recorded each reaction carefully, the flare of envy in an eye, the slump of a starving shoulder, the trembling of a man asked to eat in silence while another was denied. In his notebook, his lines were exact, written in neat hand. Withheld food produces quicker obedience than pain. Observe jealousy forming. Observe prayer weakening. Soon he made the meals themselves into weapons. To some he gave more than the stomach could hold, forcing them to chew through heap after heap until their bellies swelled and their throats burned with bile. He ordered them to swallow coal dust baked into bread until their lips blackened, and when the men gagged or vomited, he marked the moment as if it were a measurement of will. To others he placed bowls just out of reach, the smell of salted pork filling the chamber while their stomachs twisted. He did not eat with them, but neither did he appear hungry. His calm face and steady posture told them he could live forever without food, that he existed beyond flesh. The message was clear. Hunger ruled them, but he ruled hunger. The cruelty was not only in the distribution but in the rhythm. Meals arrived at odd intervals, sometimes 3 in a single night, other times nothing for 2 full days. Elias used the element of surprise as a tool, watching how their minds unraveled when no cycle could be trusted. He forced them to kneel before food, commanding them to recite prayers over bowls of bread laced with dust, telling them to thank the cave for its gifts. Some did so with tears running down their faces, desperate to be fed, while others spat curses until their weakness bent them into silence. Each outcome pleased Elias, for he believed rebellion and surrender were both steps toward his greater design, the breaking of spirit. In one of his cruelest rituals, he chose a man from each group and ordered him to eat alone while the others watched. The chosen would chew in trembling shame, choking on each mouthful under the gaze of starving companions. Soon suspicion grew among them, whispers that some were favored, that others hoarded. Fists struck in the shadows, men clawed at one another for crumbs. The cave became less a prison and more a pit of animals, and Elias observed with the quiet focus of a scholar, his notebook filled with lines that no one would read. Hunger makes brothers turn wolves. Shared starvation breaks bonds. Isolation through appetite produces silence. One night he rolled a full sack of grain into the chamber and slit it open so the kernels spilled in a small golden hill. He placed it in plain sight but forbade anyone from touching it. Days passed as men stared at the heap, their eyes sunken, their mouths dry, their fingers twitching against stone. The sack became more than food. It became an idol of torment. Some prayed to it, others cursed it, and a few tried to steal handfuls only to be dragged back by Elias, beaten with the handle of his lamp, then forced to lick the dust of the spilled kernels off the floor like animals. He wrote of this in his book as the gospel of submission, believing hunger was not only a tool but a scripture, teaching men that to live was to obey the one who fed them. As bodies weakened, so did minds. One man began to laugh at nothing, giggling while chewing pebbles as if they were sugar. Another tried to gnaw leather straps until his gums bled. Two brothers fought until one cracked the other's head against stone, not for food but from rage born of emptiness. Elias recorded each act without pity, noting the exact hour, the cause, the outcome. He did not see men dying but lessons unfolding, pages in his scripture. To him their collapse was proof that hunger was more sacred than faith, more binding than love, more absolute than law. The chamber echoed with the groans of hollow bellies, and still Elias walked calm among them, lifting his lamp over gaunt faces and trembling hands, the ledger never leaving his grip. He wrote of each failure as if carving commandments into stone. By the time the 5th week began, the men no longer spoke of rescue, no longer whispered to one another for comfort. Hunger had stripped them of language, leaving only the weak rattle of breath. Elias looked upon this silence with the satisfaction of a priest before an altar, believing he had proven that men did not need hope or freedom. They needed only the hand that chose when they would eat and when they would starve. In that belief he felt no guilt, only purpose. And as he closed his ledger on another page of careful notes, the cave seemed to hum with approval, as if even the earth itself had accepted hunger as holy law. The chamber had grown quieter, but the silence was not peaceful. It was the fragile lull that follows torment when men are too weak to argue, too starved to fight, and too broken to pray. Yet now and then a cry would rise out of the dark, sharp and desperate, cutting through the stillness like a blade. At first Elias tolerated it, even seemed to welcome it, for each wail was proof that his design had reached deeper than bone. But as the cries grew more frequent, as grief and madness broke through the submission he had shaped, Elias turned again to invention. He believed suffering was wasted if it did not become order, and noise was chaos that needed to be bent into structure. In the side tunnels where the stone walls sweated and the drip of water never ceased, he carved shallow channels and fitted hollow pipes into the rock. They were crude, hammered from bent tin and warped iron, yet when the first scream was forced into them, the sound changed. The raw edge of agony stretched into long notes echoing through the chamber until it resembled the rise and fall of a hymn. The miners recoiled when they heard it, for it seemed less like a scream and more like the cave itself had found a voice. Elias called it choir practice, a phrase he spoke without humor, his expression calm and devout. He said each cry was a hymn to order, each echo a proof that pain could be transformed into worship. When one man, delirious with fever, screamed until his throat tore, Elias guided his body close to the pipes, forcing the air of his breaking lungs into the metal. The sound that emerged was long and low, haunting, vibrating against the stone as if a church organ had been hidden in the earth. The survivors pressed their hands to their ears, but Elias commanded them to listen, standing tall in the glow of his lamp, declaring that this was their choir, that this was beauty pulled from ruin. The terror of it was worse than the hunger, worse than the nails or the breath cage. For the men, the pipes made their suffering endless, stretching it into song that lingered long after the body had collapsed. They began to fear not only death, but the sound of death, for to cry out was to become part of the choir, to have one's voice twisted and amplified until it filled every corner of the mine. Some tried to stifle their own pain, biting down on tongues, swallowing their sobs, choking back coughs, anything to avoid becoming the next verse. But Elias always found a way to draw the voice out. He pressed fingers into wounds, forced men toward the pipes, coaxed the sound he wanted until the walls themselves vibrated with it. Jonas Hale, who had once been a figure of quiet strength among them, resisted longest. He whispered to the others that Elias was only a man, that the pipes were nothing but metal tricks, that faith in each other could outlast this nightmare. His words gave brief flickers of hope, shadows of defiance that almost warmed the broken men. Elias noticed. He always noticed. One night, when the chamber grew restless with murmurs, Elias took Jonas by the arm and fastened him near the largest pipe. He did not strike him or starve him. He simply forced Jonas to watch as another miner was dragged to the same spot, beaten until his body gave way and his scream was poured into the hollow iron. Jonas shut his eyes, whispering that it was false, that the cave was not a church. But the sound filled him until denial cracked. He tried to cover his ears, but the echo burrowed past flesh, vibrating in the ribs, settling in the marrow. Elias waited, patient as always. He did not lash Jonas with violence, for he knew resistance was stronger when it had something to fight. Instead, he suffocated it with proof, with the endless hymn of men broken until their voices became indistinguishable from one another. Jonas began to waver, his whispers faltering into silence, his prayers drying on his lips. When at last his body could not endure the hunger, the fever, and the grief together, a cry escaped him, short at first, then rising, long and trembling. Elias was ready. He pressed Jonas's face to the pipe, and the sound traveled through the metal, swelling into a deep, haunting note that filled the chamber. The others listened in horror as the voice that once gave them strength became part of the song that crushed it. When it ended, Elias wrote in his ledger with a steady hand, "The choir is complete. even the strong sing. He closed the book as if sealing scripture, and the cave returned to its uneasy hush. The men who survived no longer spoke of rescue, no longer whispered of hope. They sat in shadows waiting for the next scream to be shaped into a hymn, knowing it would be their own. Above ground, families lit candles at the barricade, singing soft laments for their lost. But below, the only songs that mattered were the ones Elias had crafted in iron, hymns of despair that carried through the tunnels, filling the earth with the sound of obedience and the death of faith. Weeks passed in the chamber, though time lost its meaning in the stale dark where the lamps burned only when Elias allowed them. Above ground, the families grieved with the certainty of death, convinced that stone and suffocation had claimed their husbands and sons. They gathered at the barricade with prayers and candles, believing the bodies lay crushed beneath tons of earth, unreachable but still there. Yet beneath the surface, Elias had no intention of leaving bodies to be found. To him, the greatest act of order was not killing but erasing, wiping away every trace until the world believed in a disappearance so complete it could only be explained as an act of the earth itself. He began with the weakest, those whose lungs had already been ruined by the breath cage or whose minds had broken under hunger and hymns. Their bodies were dragged to a narrow shaft Elias had prepared years before, a vent lined with stone funnels that led to a hidden furnace chamber. There the flesh was fed to fire until it cracked and fell into gray ash, the smoke drawn away through tunnels carved to vent into distant seams. The miners who still lived watched in horror as their brothers vanished, not with burial, not with mourning, but with a hiss and a flame that left no bone intact. Elias carried the ash in sacks, pouring it into coal piles until it mingled with black dust. He loaded the mixture into carts bound for the surface, knowing that when the shipments left the mine, the remains of the dead would be carried into homes, burned in stoves, spread as heat through the very air the town breathed. The people thought they warmed their children with coal, never knowing it carried the remnants of fathers and brothers. He repeated this with methodical calm, each act measured, each erasure recorded in his ledger. He wrote of bodies as numbers, flesh as weight, ash as evidence removed. He believed the true perfection of control was not leaving corpses behind to rot, but removing even the memory of form. When the miners begged for the bodies to be spared, to be buried in stone at least, Elias silenced them with the same phrase, "The earth swallows what is weak." He told them it was not murder but sacrifice, that they should be grateful their companions had been returned to the system that fed them all. By the third week, fear no longer held shape among the survivors. They lived knowing that each cough or stumble marked them as next, that their bodies would leave no sign for families above to find. One by one, they vanished into the vent and the fire. Each erasure was done with such calm that it carried a twisted dignity, as though Elias believed he was writing the last verses of a hymn rather than burning lives to dust. His mind was no longer fixed only on punishment, but on ritual, on crafting a final offering that would leave the earth cleansed of all resistance. Above ground, questions did rise. Some of the townsmen whispered about why the collapse had yielded no tremors, no broken timbers, no sounds of digging. But Elias, standing firm with his ledger in hand, answered with a calmness that silenced doubt. He said the earth had swallowed them whole, closed its mouth without leaving a scrap behind. The families, desperate for an explanation that matched their grief, accepted it. They built crosses without bodies, wept over ground that held nothing, and repeated his words until belief hardened into truth. The earth swallowed them. No one dared think otherwise. Below, Elias performed his final ritual of erasure. He lined the survivors against the wall, gaunt men with hollow eyes and trembling limbs. He told them they were no longer minors, no longer fathers or brothers, no longer men at all. They were faceless, reduced to the system, and soon they too would vanish as the others had. He stripped them of names, referring to them only by marks in his book. He forced them to kneel in silence while he recited passages of his own invention, words about balance, obedience, and the mercy of disappearance. To him, this was not cruelty but transcendence. He was erasing identity, turning the 45 into a single offering, a nameless sacrifice swallowed by his vision of order. When the last was dragged into the furnace shaft, Elias stood alone in the chamber, his lamp throwing shadows on stone. There was no blood, no heap of corpses, no evidence of violence. The space was empty, silent and cleansed. Above, the town believed in tragedy. Below, Elias knew it was not tragedy but design. He closed his ledger, smoothed his coat, and prepared to emerge as the sole survivor. The man who would claim to have watched the earth itself consume 45 men in silence. He would be mourned with honor, pitied as a witness, and praised for his calm. No one would know the truth that the earth had swallowed nothing and that Elias Grigg had erased life more completely than stone ever could. And as he climbed toward the surface, leaving behind a chamber stripped of voices, he carried with him the satisfaction of a ritual fulfilled. The world above would never find bodies, never prove a crime, never hear the screams turn to hymns. For the 45 had not died. They had vanished without blood, consumed by a man who believed erasure was the highest form of control. And in that silence, Elias found the perfect shape of his order. When Elias Grigg emerged from the shaft, his face was pale with dust and streaked with ash, but his steps were steady. The crowd surged toward him as though he carried the dead back in his shadow. Mothers cried out, wives clutched at his coat, children stared with hollow eyes, waiting for names to follow. But Elias spoke with a quiet certainty that silenced even the loudest grief. He said the collapse had been instant, that the earth had closed on the men so quickly that no one drew a final breath. He said he alone survived by miracle, spared only so that the town might know what had happened. His voice did not shake, his eyes did not dart. He recited tragedy with the same calm rhythm he had once used to list safety drills, and that composure made his words feel true. The officials who came from the county listened and took notes, but Elias's account was so complete, so precise that no one dared question. He led them to the mouth of the shaft and showed the dust rising, the timbers bowed, the stones piled in convincing ruin. He pointed to the jagged seams and explained that no dig could reach so deep, that no man could survive such weight. His authority held, and the crowd clung to his account the way a drowning hand clings to driftwood. To doubt him meant clinging to hope, and hope was unbearable when food still needed to be earned and mouths still needed to be fed. Within days, the men were declared legally dead, their names inked into records without bodies, their deaths sealed on paper though not in soil. No graves were dug, There were no coffins, no processions, no shovels breaking the earth to mark a resting place. The town built no memorial, for to memorialize meant to remember. And remembering brought questions that no one could afford to ask. Instead, they lit candles in windows for a few weeks, then let the wax burn out and turned back to the fields and the houses and the endless work of survival. The mine's hoist stood silent, but its shadow stretched across the town like a black reminder that could not be buried. Elias walked among them not as a villain, but as a witness. The man who had seen the earth devour 45 men, and who lived now to tell of it. Women brought him bread, children stared at him with reverence, and officials signed his reports with heavy hands. He became the guardian of the story, and his word hardened into history, but whispers still lingered, faint as drafts that slipped through cracked boards. On storm nights, when rain fell heavily and the wind pressed down into the valley, some said they heard screams carried up from the shaft. They said the cave groaned like a wounded thing, that the sound of men crying in chorus echoed through the timbers. The old women crossed themselves and told children not to listen, but the young could not help pressing their ears to the ground. What they heard was never proven, yet it traveled in hushed tones from porch to porch until the fear of believing grew greater than the fear of forgetting. The whispers never left the shadows, because to bring them into the light would mean accusing Elias, and no one was brave enough to turn suspicion on the only man who had survived. Poverty made silence easy. Families needed the coal wages they had once provided, and even without the mine, the company controlled the land. To question Elias was to risk eviction, to risk starvation, to risk drawing attention from officials who had already closed the records. Fear made silence absolute. When one widow begged for the shaft to be reopened, she found her neighbors turned cold. Her pleas met with stares of warning. Within weeks, she packed her children and left, her name struck from the rolls. Others who muttered too loudly about the missing men found themselves isolated until grief turned inward, folding in on itself until nothing remained but tired acceptance. Elias moved quietly among them, never raising his voice, never demanding loyalty. He did not need to. His authority lived in their silence, in their need to believe that the earth itself had swallowed their men. He wrote the final report, signing his name beneath the account of collapse, and the county sealed the papers. The mine closed soon after, abandoned not out of justice but out of convenience. The field that held its mouth grew over with weeds, the timbers rotting into the soil until only a hollow depression marked where the shaft had once breathed. Years passed and children ran across the unmarked field without knowing what lay beneath. Their parents did not tell them, for telling would mean remembering, and remembering would mean asking what no one dared to answer. The screams faded into rumor, the whispers into story, the story into silence. Elias lived in that silence like a man protected by armor, his face calm, his hands steady, his ledger hidden away. The town had agreed, whether by fear or by need, to forget. And in that forgetting, the 45 men vanished more completely than if the earth had truly swallowed them whole. The field remained empty and the silence remained deep. But beneath it all lay the truth that only Elias carried, a truth he never needed to confess because forgetting had already done his work for him. Decades slipped away, and the town that once lived by the mouth of the mine aged into quiet ruin. Children who had run over the abandoned field without knowing its history grew into adults who carried only fragments of whispers. The shaft rotted, timbers sagged, and weeds crept over the place where families had once gathered in grief. Yet the silence did not erase everything. In the archives of the county, contradictions began to surface. An old clerk sorting through supply ledgers noticed entries that did not match the story etched into memory. Barrels of food ordered months after the supposed collapse. Lamp oil delivered in unusual quantities, ventilation supplies marked with Elias Grigg's name long after the mine was declared sealed. On their own, these were small anomalies. Together they formed cracks in the wall of silence that had stood for so long. It was not until the 1920s, when an eager young historian searching for material on labor conditions stumbled across the sealed records, that the truth began to breathe again. Among the papers were hidden notes tucked between official forms, scraps that must have been overlooked when the files were locked away. They were letters from widows who had never stopped asking, never stopped pressing the company for answers. Their handwriting was shaky, their pleas desperate, but their persistence revealed a refusal to accept what had been fed to them. One wrote of screams she claimed to hear on storm nights. Another described how Elias had refused to meet her eyes when she begged for the chance to see the rubble herself. Their voices had been dismissed in their time, but on paper, decades later, they cut with sharp suspicion. The historian dug deeper, and what he found shattered the myth of the lone survivor. In a box mislabeled as payroll documents lay Elias's personal notebooks, pages that should never have surfaced. Written in neat, deliberate script, they described his philosophy with chilling clarity. He wrote of perfect order through elimination, of the belief that men could only be purified when their flaws were stripped away by control. He described each stage of the ordeal, though never in crude terms. His language was calm, scientific, detached. He wrote of testing breath, of punishing movement, of silencing cries until they became hymns. And he wrote of disappearance, of removing bodies so that no trace remained, because erasure was the highest form of obedience. For Elias, the mine had never been a place of labor. It had been a temple, and the men had been his sacrifice. When the writings came to light, outrage spread through newspapers, labor unions, and families who had carried grief without answers for nearly half a century. The idea that the 45 might not have been crushed by stone but consumed by a man's design broke through the silence that had once bound the town. Investigations were launched, but Elias Grigg had long since gone to the grave, buried with honors as a man who had endured tragedy and survived when others could not. He had died praised as a figure of resilience, his name spoken with respect, his ledger hidden away until time itself loosened its grip. Now the truth turned his image into something monstrous. Yet punishment was impossible. He had escaped judgment by dying in peace, leaving only his writings as confession. Still, the revelations changed something larger than his memory. Lawmakers responded to the public's horror with new requirements. From then on, every mining disaster demanded recovery of bodies, no matter the cost, no matter how deep the shafts ran. No man would be declared dead without proof. Families would have remains to bury, graves to stand over, names carved into stone rather than erased into silence. Safety codes were expanded, inspections enforced, and the idea of a mine as a sealed tomb was replaced with obligation to the living and the dead alike. Elias's hidden gospel of submission, when uncovered, became an unintentional catalyst for laws that sought to prevent anyone from ever vanishing so completely again. A memorial was raised at last, decades too late, on the empty field where the shaft had once gaped. 45 names carved into granite, surrounded by iron rail, stood in place of graves that never existed. Families brought flowers even though generations had passed, and some wept though they had never known the faces carved into the stone. The memorial was not closure, but it was acknowledgement, a quiet defiance against the silence that Elias had worked so carefully to preserve. Yet even in the shadow of the monument, the horror lingered. For the writings revealed not only what he had done, but how he had thought, and that was perhaps the most unsettling truth. Elias Grigg had not raged, had not shouted, had not foamed with madness. He had written in clean lines, spoken in calm tones, and smiled in ways that seemed like care. His evil had not been the kind that burned hot and wild, but the kind that cooled into structure, that organized itself into ledgers, rules, and rituals. He had hidden behind duty, behind necessity, behind the illusion of a man who valued safety above all. And because of that, no one had seen until it was too late. The lesson he left was not confined to the mine nor to history. It whispered across time, a warning etched not in coal dust but in the architecture of control. Evil does not always roar. It whispers, it organizes, it wears the face of authority and convinces others to obey. It builds structures that look like safety and rituals that look like order. And once it is accepted, once silence replaces doubt, it consumes without leaving a trace. The film closes with that reflection, the image of the memorial standing silent on an empty field, the names of the lost glowing faintly under weathered stone. A voice lingers with the weight of a question. Evil thrives not in chaos, but in structure, in silence, in obedience. What do you think? Could this happen again, beneath another earth, in another system, with another man who hides behind duty? And the screen fades, leaving the viewer alone with the unsettling thought that the answer may already be unfolding, unseen, in the quiet places where order masks itself as care.